Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be. Merry Christmas. We're very pleased you're here. The Lord bless you in these moments, and bless me too. Tomorrow is Easter Sunday. Easter Sunday 8 years ago, my wee Ethel died. If you can arrange it, because we're going to die in one day, aren't we? Great day to die if you must. It's Easter Sunday, Resurrection Day. I don't care about the word Easter. I don't care about any of that. I just know that tomorrow, believers all over the world will take the opportunity to celebrate the resurrection of our Lord Jesus. Some of this might get tricky, so you be patient, won't you? And think hard, and then talk to people about it if you choose to. The title of the lesson, what? You won't die? Here in John chapter 6, the whole chapter is one of these complex conversations, almost ongoing conversation that Jesus has with whoever it is that's around him. He has just fed a multitude with little or nothing. They're astonished at the bread becoming, and the fish becoming what is adequate for their means. And it happens in a wilderness. You have this background of Moses delivering Israel and feeding them, being fed in the wilderness. Would you remember this? Will you remember this? Every time you open up the Gospels and Jesus is in it, the piece you're reading, it doesn't make any difference who he's speaking to, whether he's arguing with a critic or whether he's speaking praise to someone who's done well, or he's helping someone who's ill back on their feet, anything like that. No matter what it is, if Jesus is in it, will you remember this? That there are two worlds colliding in that story, whatever story it is. For Jesus of Nazareth is God being a man. And at the incarnation, God walked into our world. When I say world, what do I mean? I mean not only to a physical planet with sticks and stones, trees, mountains, and all of those things. I mean that, of course. That's where humans live. But when I say he walked into our world, I mean the shape of it, the things that go on in it, the cultural forms in it, the economic structures, the military, the political, all of these things that make the planet the place in which we live. And the world that God came into in and as Jesus Christ was very wicked. Not wicked in totality. Watch me, I'll use phrases that are overstatements. I'm just warning you, okay? So you watch me and say, well, that's not altogether true, and so you should. When I say the world is filled with wickedness, it's a good phrase. John will use it and say, the whole world lies in the evil one. It's just speech. There were good people in the world when Jesus came. There were, well, his mother, for example. And there was Simeon and Anna, and multiply. There were people who were lovely and fine and lovers of God when Christ came into the world, when God came into the world as Jesus Christ. So it's all right to say the world is filled with evil, as long as we understand the world is not filled with evil. There is good in our world. Yes? So, into our world, filled with wickedness, hurt, oppression, abuse, loneliness, illness, sinfulness, all of that, yes? Into that world came someone, God, in and as Jesus. Into that world came another world, another way of thinking, another way of speaking, another way of behaving. And all of that world, that way of thinking, that world view, and that world speech, and that world behavior and attitude, it came embodied in this one we know as Jesus of Nazareth. A new world came into our world when he came. And as he speaks and teaches truth in the face of error all over the place. Yes? So do this. I think this is good advice. As soon as you open up the Gospels and Jesus is in it, say to yourself, say it out loud if you wish. I do. Say to yourself, two worlds are colliding here. The world as God would have it and would live in it if he became a human, which of course he did. And this is how he will live. The other side of him, outside of him, all over the place, were people who lived in the world shaped without God, shaped having rejected God. And that world filled with ugliness and all of those things. Yes? Okay. In John 6, he has fed a multitude. They're amazed. Little bread, little fish, and he fills us all up. They want him to be a king for lots of obvious reasons, but he won't have it. By and by, he begins to speak about the miracle that he wrought. And he said, you come to me, whoever it is he's speaking to, and that includes the apostolic group, of course, but whoever else he's speaking to, he said, you've come to me not because you saw the sign. Not because you saw the sign, but because you ate the bread. Well, I mean, the multiplied bread was the sign. Only if you had the heart to see it. What they saw was the miracle. What they saw, though they couldn't understand, of course the bread kept coming, they saw all of that, they ate it. They saw the bread, they saw the act, but they didn't see the meaning of the act. If you and I had been there when they crucified Jesus Christ, 3 crosses up there, 1 in the middle, 2 guys either side, we would have looked at all 3, and if we didn't know the story, we would say, 3 crucifixions. True. You might then talk about the 2 who were brigands, robbers. They were insurrectionists against Rome, but they were bad guys. One text called one of them a murderer. Barabbas. He's an insurrectionist and a murderer. That's who these guys are. And you can talk about that. You can talk about the cultural situation, the political, and all of that. When you get to the one in the middle, it's just a crucifixion. No, it's not just a crucifixion. Someone could walk away, but we knew the story. She doesn't. She walks away. Well, what did you see? I just saw crucifixion. I just saw 3 people dying and one guy in the middle. She sees a crucifixion, but she doesn't see the sign. They ate the bread, but they didn't know what his whole action was about. So he says to them, you came to me because you saw the bread, because you ate the bread, but you didn't see the sign. And what is the sign? He's a greater than a mosaic figure. Moses fed them in the wilderness, and when they saw that, they would have looked back in history and thought, we're on our way to freedom, you see. That whole setting about the Exodus, Moses has taken the nation on the way to freedom. And in the middle of the desert, they overcame desert conditions. All of that they would have thought of. And they would have thought, Jesus is going to be our king, and they try to make him a king by force, and he won't have it. So now he's speaking again about the miracle. You saw the miracle. You saw the bread. You ate the bread. You did all of that. You were in it. You saw it. But you didn't see it. He'd say that about himself on a number of occasions. Some fellows said, where did he get all this fancy talk, all this rich teaching, all of that? He's the carpenter fella. Others said, yeah, we know his brothers and sisters. And Jesus will, in one case, say, yes, you do know where I'm from, but you don't know where I'm from at all. You see me, but you don't see me. It's all about vision, isn't it? It's all about heart. It's all about the truth that shapes the heart. We see the things in front of us, but meaning? What does it mean? The young guy in the middle? Paul says of him in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ died. Big deal. We know that. We saw it. And then he says, Christ died, listen, for our sins. For ours. Those 3 words you don't see unless you know the story. All kinds of things are happening in front of us. We can't get them all. You know that, and I know that. But the more we think with a God-centered sense of things, the more we look and wonder. G.K. Chesterton didn't have a lot of trouble. He would see a boy and a girl and madly in love with one another going down the road, and he said, that's not just a boy and a girl in love, that's Adam and Eve. He had a habit of doing that. He saw everything different. Now, that's part of his wiring, but part of the truth he drank in. Jesus in John chapter 6 will say, the bread I gave you The bread I gave you? It's like the bread they ate in the wilderness. This is all in John 6, and I can't stop to read all the verses, or we'll be here all day, and my daughter will give me the thumbs down business. Jesus said, the bread I give you to eat, you ate it, you know what'll happen? You'll die. As Moses gave your parents bread in the wilderness in a miraculous event, they ate it, but they aren't here anymore. They died. You know what the bread is that I gave you? It's me. It's not literally me. Did they need to be told that? Not really. He says, the bread that I give to you, it's me. And here, I'd like to spend a moment or two on. He says in John 6, verse 49 and 50, your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. 649, I don't know what I said. It should have said 649. And then he says in 650, this is the bread. Maybe he pointed at himself with his finger. Maybe. It helps me to think he did. Your fathers ate the bread in the wilderness and they're dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and, listen, if you're not reading, that one may eat of it and not die. Wait. Eat, feed on Christ, and you won't die? Well, what we're sure of is he cannot possibly mean you will not experience physical dying. Of course, believers do that. Then he says to Mary in John 11, you remember, Lazarus is now dead, and Christ tells her that he's going to live again. And he says in 11:25, this is John 11:25, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, yet shall he live. Well, now that makes sense. Though he may die, yet he live resurrection-wise. And then he says, and whosoever lives and believes in me, shall never die. Wish he'd make his mind up. Listen, I am the resurrection and the life. Listen, he that believes on me, though he were dead, or though he dies, yet shall he live. We get that. The man who believes on Christ will die, and then when the resurrection comes around, he will live again. That's plain enough. And then he says, and whosoever lives and believes on me will never die. And then he says, you believe that? You believe that? Well, it all sounds very nice and all, but it's confusing. What is he doing? What's he saying? Here's what I think he's saying. Here's what I'm sure he's saying. Nobody takes death as seriously as Christians do. I know some Christians who don't, but nobody takes death as seriously as Christians do. And that's the case because no one took death as seriously as Jesus did. You're a Christian. You believe he says you will never die. But you know, unless he comes and puts an end to all of this, you are going to die. I'm going to be out of here before you know it. Watch me dropping dead when I'm talking to you. Do you believe this? That you will not die if you believe in Jesus? Well, no, we're going to physically die. Then what does he mean? Jesus sees death. Jesus sees death as more than biological dying. There would not be death in the world if the human family, following Adam's lead, had not turned away from God. In turning away from God, as in the garden, he's turned away from a tree of life, which counteracted his mortality. He was immortal, don't you see? God made him capable of dying, mortal. But the tree of life, which they had freedom to eat of, when he ate of that, it counteracted mortality. The tree of life was the source of his ongoing life. When he turned against God, he was cut off from, in the Genesis narrative, he's cut off from the tree of life, and his mortality set in, and he finally biologically dies. But the fact that he biologically dies, the fact that his mortality takes over and he dies, is generated by his sin. It's triggered by his sin. His sin cuts him off from life-sustaining source. Yeah. So, when Jesus, and you too, if you think about it, when we see death and see it as Jesus sees it, we see it as a mark, a proof, an exhibition and demonstration that sin has come into the world. Romans 5:12 tells us, as by one man sin entered the world, and death came upon everybody. With sin, death entered, and everybody died because everybody sins. Death is the exhibition, the physical proof. It means something. Death is not simply biological cessation. It's the proof that sin has dominated the world. That was Romans 5:12. Romans 5:21. Well, 5:12, sin reigned, death reigned through sin. In 5:21, he says, sin reigns through death. Sin reigns. He personifies sin. He makes it a person, you see. And sin in 5:21, sin reigns. Sin is a king. And how do you know, 5:21, that sin reigns? Because people die. How do you know that all this dying, this physical dying business, is the result of sin entering the world, corrupting everything and corrupting us, and we die? In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 15, 14, he, speaking of Jesus, since the children were partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise partook of the same, that through dying he might destroy him that had the power of death, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. In that text, Hebrews 2:14, it links dying with Satan. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, begin at 45 all the way down. He tells us a number of things, but he tells us that the sting of death, the stinger, what kills you, the sting of death is sin. Do you know why we die physically? Others will say, you just wear out. That's true. But why do we just wear out? Well, that's the way the body is made. It's the way it is right now, that's true. We just wear out. But why do we just wear out? Because we turned away from God, who is the source of life. And in the Genesis narrative, it's him feeding and his wife feeding on the tree of life, in which God vested the power to counteract his mortality. Why do we die? Humanity, I mean. Because we sin. Because there's a world dominated by evil that started way back there. And we die as even the innocent, babies, for example, even the righteous, they die because they live in a world that has turned against God. They are part of a human family which is under the judgment of God. And they share death. And that's why Jesus died. He became one of us, and he died. So when Jesus says in John 6 and in John 11, eat of me, feed on me. I'm the bread that has come down out of heaven, and if you eat that bread, you will never die. He means death, not in its mere biological sense, but death as the mark of the domination of sin. Let me pick that up again, will you? I think our time is up.